Hello and welcome along to this week's Liverpool.com podcast. I'm your host for this week, Matt Addison. Andrew Beasley is alongside me once again. Before we get started, to get the best discount off your NordVPN plan, go to nordvpn.com/bloodred. Our link will also give you 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. There's no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, and the link for that is in the podcast description below. For the rest of the show, though, we're going to have a little bit of a chat around Arne Slot's first game. It was a good 2-0 victory for the Reds, Andrew, at Ipswich. It looked a little bit tricky in the first half, but I think we saw Liverpool's quality shine through in the second. What were your initial thoughts on what was Arne Slot's first competitive match? Not the first time that we've seen them, of course, but the first time that we've seen them in the Premier League.
Yeah, without wanting to reach for a cliche immediately, it was a bit of a game of two halves, wasn't it? Because Ipswich did very well in the first half. Liverpool, not so much, didn't really create anything. I don't think Ipswich did either. To be fair, they had a few shots. It wasn't too bad, but there was clearly room for improvement. But yeah, after the break, Liverpool were phenomenal, really. Ipswich barely had a look in. Liverpool should really have scored more than the 2 goals. They had 6 big chances, which in one half of football is very, very rare indeed. So, yeah, you have to be pleased with that. I suppose acknowledging the slow start and the fact it was against a team that was in League One about 15 months ago. You have to be happy at least with the second half performance.
Yeah, it was certainly an interesting contrast between the first and the second half. I think part of that we will come to in terms of a ruthless decision that was made at half-time, obviously, with Jarell Quansah. We'll come to that in a second. But I think it was probably just as much about maybe Ipswich had run out of steam, certainly by the hour mark, probably after the first half as well. I thought it was really, really sensible play, really, by Liverpool. It was quite pragmatic in a way, and that you'd obviously expect Ipswich to start well and start fast. The crowd was up, the music, the person over the loudspeaker was doing his best to get everybody up for it. I don't think they needed too much encouragement, in fairness, but it was sort of one of those where you just want to see Liverpool not concede the first goal and score the first goal when it came to it. But I think that was pretty much what you'd expect, really, from Liverpool, and that's kind of what they did in the end.
Yeah, as much as the first half performance wasn't amazing, I wasn't sort of too concerned either. As I said, it's not like Ipswich had created too much, and you had to think that they were going to run out of steam a little bit with how much they'd put into it. I was sort of impressed with how well they pressed Liverpool, particularly in the first half. But doing that takes its toll. It's one thing doing that in the Championship, another thing entirely at Premier League level when you're up against sort of international superstars and things like that. But I think it's important. We saw last season how Liverpool repeatedly made bad starts and would go behind. And that never really looked in threat here that was going to happen. So, yeah, I mean, away from home, there's certainly nothing wrong with going in at halftime 0-0 and then going on again from there. And that's exactly what they did. So, yeah, just keeping Ipswich out, at least as a sort of minimum requirement, was achieved. And then they obviously built and kicked on from there.
Yeah, it took a little bit of time for them to get into the stride, but I thought quite a few individuals, as well as will come to, improved in the second half. It was obviously better collectively, and Arne Slot was very quick to point to the duels and all of that sort of thing improving. But it doesn't take much, really, for just 1 or 2 players to step up, and suddenly Liverpool can look very different. But we're going to talk through a few different bits from the game. We'll start with Jarell Quansah, and do keep your comments coming in as well. We'll try and get to a few of those as we go along. Good morning to Lee and O'Neill in the comments there that I can see. Anybody else that's watching along as well. But let's do the Jarell Quansah conversation. I don't know about you, but I assumed at halftime it must have been an injury, because for me, he didn't do that badly in the first half. I think that was the general consensus from a few of us that were down there. But what were you surprised that Jarell Quansah came off? Do you think it was the right decision? How much of an impact as well do you think it made in that second half?
Yeah, I was surprised, certainly. I think we're kind of preconditioned as fans to think that the halftime sub is just like a really bad thing. Like, oh, you could normally tell if someone's coming off at halftime. He had a stinker in the first half. Got to get him off and get him changed. That's how we sort of think with that sort of thing. And there was no indication of that from Quansah in the first half. I thought he did decent enough. Certainly wasn't thinking that he needed to be withdrawn. But I think it's really interesting that he was. Klopp didn't make all that many first half substitutions. I had a look, he made 7 in the league last season. You had some managers getting into sort of double figures. I think Brighton made about 25. And obviously, you're not going to make lots of half-time substitutions if everything's going perfectly. But at the same time, Liverpool had a lot of poor starts last season. It's not like they were starting games all that well. So it felt like a very bold move from Slot. I sort of tried to make a point about that on Twitter last night and didn't do it in the best way. And I think it was misconstrued by a lot of people. But I just think you can learn a lot from how a manager manages in the first game and the substitutions they make and stuff like that. You know, if we look back to Klopp's first game now, a 0-0 draw at Tottenham, people won't remember very much about the game. I certainly don't. I think Origi hit the bar with a header, but it's not like there was too much. The iconic image from that game is Lallana being substituted and basically collapsing in Klopp's arms, showing that, right, a new intense brand of football is here and this is how we're going to play and these sorts of things. And obviously the Quansah thing wasn't the same in that respect, but what it did show was Slot is unafraid to make these big calls and he's going to take a player off who, at least as far as I could tell, wasn't even playing that badly. But he's like, no, this isn't quite working as I want it to work, so we're going to make that change. And I'm not saying Klopp wouldn't have done that, but I feel it's probably less likely he'd have done that. So again, it's a first game substitution that may actually prove to be somewhat iconic if we see this sort of thing from Slot. It doesn't happen again. But I just thought it was interesting that, like, no, he's laying down a marker and saying, you did pretty well, Jarell, but you were still losing these duels and I need to take you off and I need to bring Konate on. So a bold move. Fascinating to see if it's one we're going to see regularly.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say it's not a slight on Jarell Quansah necessarily as well. No. There was a number of players that it could have been, but it's obviously easier to take off a slightly younger player, or it's easier to take off a player in that position. If you'd have took off Virgil van Dijk, for example, that would have been a big story. Or, you know, Trent, I didn't think had the best of first halves, obviously improved a lot in the second, but it's a bigger story if it's one of those two players, just to take those two as examples. And let's move on to Trent as well. I thought him, Alexis McAllister improved after the half-time break. Mohamed Salah, obviously, the quality of him shone through. Diogo Jota missed the chance, but then, you know, didn't take long to get off the mark for the season after that, after the header had gone wide. It was sort of a case for me, really, of Liverpool improving. Obviously, Konate helped, but it sometimes just helps if Mohamed Salah and Trent Alexander-Arnold play well. Then, you know, if they improve, realistically, Liverpool were going to find some spaces to score.
Yeah, well, you mentioned it earlier. I think, with the quality Liverpool have, they only need sort of a couple of players to step up a little bit. And then suddenly they look a lot better team and they cause the opposition team a lot more problems. I thought it was really interesting. You may have seen yesterday, there was an article on Sky Sports News and it was sharing like the sprinting stats for the first weekend of the Premier League. And Salah was top, despite being obviously, you know, a veteran these days. Sorry, he was second top. The player who was top was Ipswich defender Leif Davis, who basically had to sprint after Salah. So, you know, the two of them in battle with each other ended up the top two players for sprints in the Premier League this weekend. So that sort of shows you get Salah doing those sorts of things. You just get Trent a little bit better position, perhaps, able to deliver those fantastic passes like he did in the second half. I mean, he created the first two big chances that Liverpool had. He then obviously played the pass for the first goal. I mean, that alone, you know, gets him a decent rating for the match in my book, probably those sort of couple of crosses and that pass and stuff like that. And that's the ability that he's got. That's the ability he brings. If we can get back a bit more to him and Salah sort of linking up, felt like we sort of lost that a little bit with Trent drifting inside. I've always been more of a fan of him as a right back. If we get that on back happening on a regular basis, then I think, you know, obviously that's going to lead to a lot of goals and assists for both this season, I should think.
I think that's interesting that you mentioned there about him being a bit more of a normal right back as well. I think that there was a couple of moments, I can't remember whether this was one of the goals or whether this was a chance, but where he plays it into Szoboszlai and almost does a little 1-2 and then dribbles through the centre of the pitch. I think that's the perfect scenario really for me, where he does more stuff at right back where there's a little bit more space for him to do those passes, but he still has the license to go through the middle and do that. And I thought, particularly sort of the last 15 minutes of the first half, the start of the second half as well, there was quite a few occasions where him and Dominik Szoboszlai swapped over. And I don't know whether this necessarily came across on the TV because maybe it was following the ball a little bit more. But there were times when he was kind of the number 10 and Szoboszlai had tracked back and taken his position on the right-hand side to maybe track the opposite fullback coming the other way. It feels to me like that's the best way of getting the most out of Trent Alexander-Arnold. You want him on the ball, but you also need him to be in space. And if the space is in the centre of the pitch, then move him across there. If the space is a little bit wider, then that's fine as well. But it almost felt at times, and this isn't, me having a go at Jurgen Klopp's tactics or anything like that, but it felt at times last season where he was doing the inverted thing. He was doing that regardless of the situation. It almost felt a little bit more fluid to me over the weekend. Obviously, it's only one game. It's a very short sample size, but that feels like a bit of a step in the right direction, really. If you want Trent to be at his best, you've got to give him a little bit of a license to do what he thinks is best in that moment, I'd say.
Yeah, definitely. And if we think back to sort of Klopp's best teams, you would often see Trent doing whatever he was doing and then Henderson would cover. So if it's now going to be Szoboszlai, then, that's fair enough. And I agree. Yeah, I think you've got to sort of let him do his own thing to some extent. And I just think he does it better with having more space. Excuse me. I did see on FB Ref's pass value model, he amassed 1.0 expected assists. And I think there's been something like 15 examples of a player doing that in a Premier League away game. Like the level of passing and the value of his passing was at an elite level that very few players have matched in the last sort of 7 or 8 years. And as ever, we have to say, it's against a newly promoted side and things like that. But equally, he must have picked up almost all of that in one half of the match because he didn't do a great deal in the first half. So just these little tweaks from Slot, it is going to be a bit of a learning curve for everybody, himself, the team, the fans, everyone. And maybe they will start games slowly and then, improve and things like that. But yeah, if they can get Trent on the ball in space, that's got to be sort of almost priority number one for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I don't want to go over old ground, but the contract situations, I think it was a bit of a highlighting of those as well. The fact that Van Dijk just did his usual thing. Maybe was slightly fortunate. He might have given away a penalty if there wasn't the offside. But certainly Trent and Salah were the difference makers for Liverpool. And, they're inside the final year of their contract, as we know. I'm sure in the next few weeks, or certainly by January, you'd like to think that there was a fairly substantial update in terms of what might happen with that. Liverpool obviously keeping the cards close to the chest in terms of that at the moment. I suspect that Richard Hughes has probably got quite enough on his plate at the moment in terms of transfers without thinking about those things. But I'm sure that will obviously be a big talking point as well. But obviously the other big talking point from the game in terms of players that stood out was Ryan Gravenberch. I thought he was excellent again. Obviously comes with a big caveat of it's Ipswich and they didn't do a great deal in terms of getting bodies around him, and maybe Brentford would be a little bit different for that next weekend. We'll get a bit more of an idea of that. But what did you make of his performance? Are you any more convinced that he could be the solution if, dare I say, Liverpool don't make a transfer in that position, which is definitely a possibility, I would say, at this point in the window?
Yeah, he was impressive once again. I know we spoke last week's podcast about the Sevilla game, and it was somewhat similar in that he looked very good without being too heavily tested, as you say. You would imagine that Brentford will try and make more of that, and I'm sure Manchester United will the week after that if he's still in the team for that game. But it's always the same in these situations. All we can really say is all a player can do is it's up against who he's up against, and he's got to perform well against who he's up against. And you have to say that he's done that. It's just that there are bigger tests ahead, and I think it's still fair to wonder if he's going to be up to the challenge in such matches. But he's done well as far as I'm concerned so far.
Yeah, I liked him on the ball. I think there were a couple of moments, to be fair, in the first half where Ipswich, if they just had a little bit more quality or a little bit more pace in the final third, maybe it could have been slightly different. I think it was maybe Hutchinson where he chopped inside and then basically just passed the ball back to Addison. If that was a Manchester City or an Arsenal or, even a Tottenham or a Chelsea or someone like that, I think it could have been, a very different situation, and maybe we would have looked at that differently. But yeah, but for me, they still do need to get another one. I think that was the case regardless of whether Ryan Gravenberch played well, because just the midfield numbers, really. I'm writing a piece on it at the moment in terms of Bobby Clark moving on. And again, I think we mentioned this last week, but it just feels to me a bit like they are maybe one midfielder short. obviously Wataru Endo was on the bench, but didn't come on and probably wasn't really ever going to come on in terms of, I can't really think of a game state where you'd need him to have come on against Ipswich. It does feel to me like they need possibly one more player in that position. But obviously another transfer question as well was Joe Gomez. The news around him kind of emerging with him not being in the Liverpool squad. It's going to be interesting, I think, to see what happens with him. Obviously of huge value to Liverpool, but he is still the fourth choice at centre-back. It's got to be a tricky decision, I think, for him, really. I suspect it will come more down to him than what Liverpool want to do, probably.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he's obviously an excellent player, and it's good having him in the squad when he can cover anywhere along the back four. We even saw him in midfield last season. I'm not saying he should do that again necessarily, but he's clearly a very versatile player. And we saw with James Milner how important it was to have somebody he could do that over his time with Liverpool. But of course, Milner was already a veteran when he moved to Liverpool. We think of Gomez possibly in sort of similar terms because he's been around so long, but he's still sort of relatively young because he was so young when he moved to Liverpool. So whereas Milner might have been reasonably happy to take on the sort of versatile multi-role job, it's understandable if Gomez doesn't want to do that. He's still got, some good years of his career ahead of him. So I would be sad for him to leave, and I suspect Liverpool aren't sort of pushing him out the door actively, but equally, he's probably one of the more sellable assets in the squad who isn't, more of a nailed-on first team, first 11 choice. So I think it could work for all parties for him to leave, but I think it would be slightly sad because he's been mostly great for Liverpool and does offer a lot to the squad.
I think it's really hard to pin a price tag on him as well. Obviously, we know that Newcastle and Liverpool had agreed a deal in principle earlier in the summer where he would have gone there for 45 million. Newcastle would have let Anthony Gordon come to Liverpool for 75 in two separate deals, but basically related to one another for PSR reasons. But I suspect that the landscape has changed really in terms of that. Newcastle were desperate for money at that particular time and agreed that with their back against the wall, it would probably cost Liverpool more to get Gordon, and probably Newcastle would be willing to spend less to get Gomez at this point in the season. But I don't know, where do you sort of see his price tag being? Because you look at Mark Gay, for example, Newcastle, I think, have had 2, maybe 3 bids rejected for him. They want sort of 65, 70 million by all accounts. For me, Joe Gomez is at least as good as Mark Gay, but Liverpool are not going to get anywhere near that. I think we have to be realistic. But I think it's really, really hard to put a price tag on him. Obviously, Liverpool don't want to sell him, but if he was to push to go, I've no idea really. Between 30 and 50 million, it could almost be any number in that bracket.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I'd edge towards the upper end of that scale myself. As you say, with sort of the money they're offering for Gahey and stuff like that, he's obviously higher valued than Gomez, and is a bit more of a current England international, actually playing games, whereas Gomez, I don't think, played at all at the Euros, did he? But I'm just looking now. I mean, he's 27 and he's got 3 years on his contract, so he certainly shouldn't be going for anything less than probably 30. I think somewhere nearer 40, ideally 50 if Richard Hughes can work some magic, But I think somewhere in that sort of price range is the way to go. Liverpool, as much as he might want to go, he is under contract. Liverpool shouldn't be letting him go for what they believe is a low price, and I'm sure they won't. But it's only right that they get fair value for him. Again, another concern I didn't mention earlier, as we talked about with Clark, as much as they're different players, it'd be another player leaving with seemingly without a replacement coming in. So if you're going to do that, you need to make sure you get value to make that worth doing, because he's another player who adds a lot to the squad, and it would be silly to get rid of him on the cheap without a replacement.
Yeah, and when you think of how much and how useful he was for Liverpool last season, you can see quite easily, I think, a route to minutes for him. It's easy to forget when you got 3 weeks at the start of this season with 1 game a week, that's not going to be the case for the whole of the season. In fact, after this little short period up until the September international break, beyond that, it is pretty much 2 games every week. There's more Champions League games. There's obviously the Carabao Cup and things like that. Now, Joe Gomez isn't going to necessarily be convinced by playing whoever it might be in the Carabao Cup in the first round that Liverpool enter that's a reason for him to stick around, of course. But I think there are going to be minutes. They're going to have to try and come up with some sort of solution really for him there. And it's just tricky, really, isn't it? All the way across the back line, really. I think Liverpool have got a decent amount of depth, but I was making the argument a few weeks ago that Liverpool needed another centre-back even before there was a question mark over Joe Gomez's future. Where do you stand in terms of, how many options Liverpool have got in those positions? If it was to stay as it is now with the four centre-backs and obviously Tsimikas and Conor Bradley as full-back cover, is that sufficient, do you think? Or even, is there an argument to go in and get someone even before we talk about Joe Gomez?
Yeah, I did want them to get somebody else in. I think we've seen before with Liverpool, it's all right thinking that 4 is enough, but it can very quickly become not enough because things happen. Van Dijk isn't an injury-prone player particularly, but Liverpool lost him for basically an entire season because of a bad challenge from Jordan Pickford, from an opposition goalkeeper. These things can happen. And all of a sudden, say that were to happen again, heaven forbid, you're then sort of looking at, right, we've got these 3 options, but Konate normally misses games. Quansah's obviously still learning the game. And, I'm not saying Slot doesn't like him, but clearly, was happy to sort of change him on the weekend. And then you've got Gomez, who's barely played centre-back in quite some time. So I think they do need another option, and they definitely do if they are going to let Gomez go. But it's I guess with the squad, it's something of a gamble in that 4 should be enough, but it can very quickly prove to be nowhere near enough.
Yeah, and you'd like to think that there was a bit of a long-term thinking as well. Obviously, we hope that Van Dijk signs a new contract, and I think there's probably a decent chance of that happening, but you've got to look to the future in terms of him. And even if he does sign a new contract, it would be nice to have an extra option to not have to play him as often, or to play him in all 8 of the Champions League group games, for example, would seem probably like a little bit of a risk in itself, not just in terms of injuries in the short term, but possibly trying to extend his career into the future as well. So it's definitely a difficult balancing act. The last talking point then, before we come on to just a quick chat about Gary Neville and his predictions, the last talking point, I want to talk a little bit more about the midfield. Obviously, we've talked a little bit around that as well, but I thought it was interesting that Dominic Szoboszlai kind of described it as, rather than a 4-3-3 with 2 number 8s, he said it was a 6, an 8 and a 10. That's obviously a slight difference. It's nothing major in terms of that, but I thought it was interesting in terms of, firstly, the way that he described it and the way that Arne Slot and his coaching staff have clearly tried to explain it to them. But I thought it was interesting that it was him in that number 10 position over Harvey Elliott as well. So what did you make, firstly, of the formation and the way that Liverpool set up?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because obviously Slot famously pointed out that his side didn't play 4-2-3-1, and then it looked pretty much like a 4-2-3-1 for lots of pre-season. It looked like it quite a bit on Saturday. The whole 6-8-10 sort of idea sort of lends itself to that a little bit. I mean, I think it worked well. I think in terms of Szoboszlai, I mean, if you're wanting a number 10 in the sort of traditional sense of that, that being a sort of creative player, then I would pick Elliott over Szoboszlai to play there. There's obviously a sort of physicality question, maybe get a bit more out of Szoboszlai in that sense. I guess it depends what you're sort of looking for from that player. But I think the midfield looks well set up. And as much as we'd like them to sign another player, Slot does have quite a few options there for the 3 positions. So it's interesting to see how he's going to balance it. I mean, I would have thought Curtis Jones would have seen some action. I think it's quite interesting actually that I think I'm right in saying that the 3 starting midfielders at Ipswich all completed the game, didn't they? And again, that's something I don't think we saw too often from Klopp last season or any season really. There'd be a substitution on the hour mark, 70 minutes, something like that. Someone coming on, maybe Milner comes on for somebody or whatever. But I think the midfield 3 all started, and he sort of made some changes at the back and in the front instead. So we'll have to see if that becomes a trend or if that's just a one-off. All these things we're sort of talking about, and they may soon quickly be forgotten. But yeah, it's interesting that he chose to do that. He picked his 3 guys and he stuck with them, even though the likes of Elliott and Jones had impressive pre-seasons.
Yeah, let's move on to Gary Neville then. I wasn't sure whether to include this on the agenda or not, but I think some of his predictions have been so ludicrous that I think we should probably talk about them. I have to say, watching him on Sky last night, he didn't even seem that convinced of it himself, to be honest. It seemed more in hope than expectation. But obviously said last week that Liverpool might not come in the top 6. He's predicted them to finish in, well, certainly outside of the top 4, potentially a little bit lower down. But I mean, where do you even start with this? It doesn't make a huge amount of sense to me. And I'm sure a lot of the Liverpool fans watching will probably agree that I think top 4 has to be the minimum aim for Liverpool, really. You'd be looking up rather than down, I would say.
Yeah, I think it said everything that he was sort of asked about it on Sky last night. And there was a long pause. And then he basically said that Liverpool had a better squad than Manchester United. So it's like, well, if that's the case, then logically Liverpool should finish higher. I think it's reasonable to have some concerns, some ideas that maybe Liverpool won't be as good as last season. They haven't signed anyone, as we all know at the moment. They're making a managerial change, which is obviously going to be hugely impactful for all concerned. It looks like it's going well so far, and obviously Slot's got a good pedigree from his work in the Eredivisie. But you know, it's not unthinkable to think that Liverpool might not be quite as good as they were last season. But again, I think this is something we touched on last week. Who's going to catch them? Who is going to be better than Liverpool? I think that's the bigger question than whether Liverpool fall off a touch from last season. You know, Tottenham played pretty well last night, but they only got a draw. You know, Manchester United were, I think it was 22 points behind Liverpool last season. I did look it up earlier because I'm working on a piece about comparing the two midfields because that's what Gary Neville did. So how are they going to make up that 22-point gap? It just doesn't look likely. You know, Chelsea remain a mess. You'd think they might come good a bit later in the season, but they've just got so many players. They've already got Raheem Sterling issuing statements about being unhappy even before the first game. So that's not a good sign for them. So it's not so much thinking Liverpool mightn't tail off a bit. It's who's catching them. And I just don't see anybody. I think it would be quite a surprise if Liverpool didn't finish in the top 3. It may have to be third, you know, in Slot's first season, and that wouldn't be a disaster by any means. But yeah, I just don't see really who's catching them.
Yeah, that's basically where I'm at really with it. I think Liverpool, without a signing, probably are the third best team in the country at the moment. I think that's probably fair. I think, you know, Manchester City, we know that the resources and what they've got. I suppose that there might be some sort of penalty for them at some point, potentially at some point this season, which might come into it. I think Gary Neville's prediction was that Arsenal were going to win the league, which again, I think is reasonable enough. You'd like to think at some point it will end that Manchester City just win it and win it and win it. I think somebody like Arsenal has been building towards it, but I do think that the pick of Manchester United from Gary Neville, I think is almost predictable, that you can kind of go, well, it's Manchester United and he's going to pick that. But I think that the real surprise really for me is that I think he went with Chelsea or possibly Tottenham. I don't know whether he changed his mind in the end in terms of what they said last night. But it just, to me, the idea that Chelsea can suddenly become better than Liverpool because they've spent money in the transfer market, to me, that is just a classic example, really, of people who think, well, Liverpool haven't spent money, other teams have spent money, and it's as simple as that. But I think Jamie Carragher made the point, really, that obviously you want Liverpool to make those signings, but it's sometimes better to not sign anybody than spend 100 million on Mudryk, or, you know, Liverpool almost spending 110 million on Moises Caicedo, for example. I'm not making the argument whatsoever that Liverpool shouldn't buy anybody, and I think it would be a big boost if they could get one or two over the line in the next couple of weeks. But it just feels so simplistic to me. I'm sure you're probably in agreement that, you know, transfers can be good, but the assumption that they definitely will be good, Chelsea, of all the examples, Chelsea feels like the obvious one to go for in terms of that not being the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know sort of from what we've heard from people like Ian Graham that that's basically is Liverpool's thinking. It's more important to sign the right player than sign the wrong player just for the sake of it, that sort of thing. And yeah, like you say, it's just that thing of like, you know, well, Chelsea have spent a lot of money, so they must get better. But that, you know, there's no guarantee. We've seen it throughout football of the teams that spend the most don't, you know, obviously they tend to do better, but there's sort of no guarantees. I mean, I'm just looking, like Liverpool have finished above Chelsea in each of the last 7 seasons since Chelsea last won the league by a total of 125 points across those 7 seasons. And obviously things can change far quicker than that. But the point is, why are they suddenly going to finish above Liverpool now with a squad that doesn't barely know each other? and, you know, a new manager who's unproven at this level. It doesn't seem to make sense to me that they're going to go at maybe, you know, they'll need to go at least 2 points a game probably to finish above Liverpool, probably more. And I just don't see it. You know, they weren't totally sort of blown away by Manchester City, and obviously that's the hardest game there probably is. But you didn't look at that team and think, well, they're going to win loads of football matches this season. They're just starting from so far back that I don't see them making up that ground.
Yeah, and I'd probably put Tottenham in a similar category. I think we saw their kind of limitations, that they weren't able to win against the newly promoted team. There's other question marks, I think, about Aston Villa and Newcastle and various other clubs as well. But yeah, I think we'll leave it there for this week. Thank you for everyone who's watched along live and put comments in the comments box. I'll go through a couple of those a little bit later on and have a look at those. But yeah, thank you very much to everyone for watching, and we shall see at the end of the season, will it be us who's right or will it be Gary Neville? We'll see.